Hello everyone, welcome to the Dome 9 webinar this morning. We're going to give people a few more minutes to join. Please stand by and we'll be right back. Hello everyone, welcome to the Dome 9 webinar, Speeding Up the Compliance Lifecycle on AWS. My name is Thelen Blum. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Dome 9, and I'm here with Patrick Pusher, Technical Evangelist for Dome 9. In today's webinar, Patrick is going to discuss how the Dome 9 ARC platform provides you with the steps to establish best practices and simplify tracking, reporting, and enforcement of compliance and security in your AWS cloud environment. The Dome 9 ARC's compliance engine provides automated compliance testing for CIS AWS Foundation's benchmark and PCI DSS, in addition to automated data aggregation and in-place remediation to deliver end-to-end compliance management. Dome 9 enables you to simplify your compliance process, establish a gold standard security posture, and cuts the time to compliance by up to 80%. We will close with Q&A at the end of the session. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the questions window of GoToWebinar, and Patrick will address as many questions as possible, time permitting. Without further ado, I will now pass the ball to Patrick. Let's get started.
Thank you, Thelen, and thanks everybody for joining us and giving us about the next 40 minutes of your time. Today we are definitely sort of focused on compliance on AWS and perhaps maybe a different approach than you've considered before. And with that, let's get started. First off, maybe let's talk about what we will cover in today's session. So I think the word compliance can mean a lot of different things, similar things, but different things to different people. So we'll talk about exactly kind of what we mean and maybe the different kinds of compliance that we see kind of in the industry. And we'll talk about why infrastructure as a service specifically makes compliance difficult. And then lastly, we will chat a little bit about Dome 9's solution. So, you know, with every breach experienced, and there were over 1,000 US data breaches last year, trust erodes. And, you know, from the FBI to LinkedIn to Verizon, we heard about them all. And the results, you know, the outcome from events like this are new or extended regulation, right, with the aim of further establishing a fundamental base of security-focused practice, right? One such example sort of are the new regulations that we saw set forth by New York's Department of Financial Services last year. And that's a really good segue kind of into the different kinds of compliance. Many years ago, kind of as I got into compliance sort of measurement in terms of traditional infrastructure, you know, I thought of it kind of as this first umbrella here, this general laws where, you know, blanket compliance kind of standards applied to lots of different organizations. PCI is a really good example. It's not so much around your vertical, it's what you're doing, right? If you are handling or processing credit cards, especially handling credit card holder data, then you have a set of data security regulations you must adhere to. Then, of course, we have kind of the industry-specific data regulations. We see a lot of them in financial. Of course, we see a lot of them in healthcare. I'm a Canadian, so what we see up here are a little bit different than what we see south of the border in the United States, but they're all focused on, typically personally identifiable data being kind of commingled with other data, making sure we take extra precaution with that classification of data for sure. Most of these industry kind of specific regulations we see in Asia and the US, certainly some in Canada as well. But in Canada, as we see in the next couple slides, we have a bit of a less prescriptive focus on compliance. Still very much a government regulated and mandated one, but maybe a little less prescriptive than in the United States, and we'll talk about that as a trend. And then the last category is the one here at Dome 9 that maybe I've been the most surprised by. I think in the last 2 years, we know about the need, of course, from mandated data data security regulation and standards. But on the other side, where maybe you're not so mandated yet, you're looking for a way to prove that security is, kind of a central tenet or a central pillar to what you do. It's this bucket where, yeah, okay, maybe they're not mandated to be compliant to a specific standard yet, are interested in the same tools and the same approaches to ensure that their stakeholders know that they take security seriously. It's in that last pillar of the no regulation that I think we find the most growth. Why that is, tough to say. I think the breach focus, the media focus on breach last year, is certainly a key sort of a reason we see that. But in general, in terms of compliance trends, I think what we see worldwide is, again, less maybe of a focus on exactly how to implement security controls within any given data security standard, and more about general principles, leaving you, kind of the infrastructure manager, with some flexibility around how to obtain these goals. That's good and bad. The less prescriptive they are, the harder it is to sort of test and audit, of course, right? That audit event when a data security standard is as open and flexible as it is, or as some of these are, can really be a complex thing. We have lots of considerations and compensating controls to consider. The more prescriptive, the easier it is to test. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons we find that compliance is still one of the key barriers to cloud adoption, as we'll talk about in the next slide. And it's probably because compliance is getting harder. As more compliance focus happens, yet as there's less focus on prescriptive testing, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and it leaves a lot of room for organizations to sort of scratch their head and say, how do I achieve the goals kind of set forth in this standard? The other thing we see is that standards are sort of almost nesting within each. We actually see standards that make a formal reference to other standards, like you see in the second bullet, with an ISO or a PCI. So, we're sort of building this ecosystem of data security standards that might make reference to others, such that we don't have to duplicate, work in the exact sort of specificity of any one particular data security standard. So a lot is happening. A lot of this is fueled, again, I think, by the independent organization, maybe not officially regulated by law yet. Again, looking for ways to prove that that security is a prime concern for them. Made reference to this in the last slide. Dome 9 takes part in a yearly cloud security survey, and last year we found that legal and regulatory compliance is the #1 fastest. It's not the biggest yet, but it's the #1 fastest growing barrier to cloud adoption. And I think we got used to a set of tools and a process to do this compliance measurement and auditing within our traditional data center network. Excuse me. And those approaches really, they fell down in any sort of infrastructure as a service environment. There are many reasons, we'll look at in the next slide why that is, but they didn't work. And so, you know, that tried and failed approach of the same age-old approach we've been doing for years, I think creates that concern of, you know, if what I know traditionally no longer works, you know, what do I do? There are some native tools I have at my infrastructure as a service provider. There are some third-party tools I can purchase. You know, how do I measure an environment that is constantly changing? And I think that's probably one of the main reasons this is such a big concern, is that, you know, we manage environment typically with an infrastructure as a service once we're there for any kind of amount of time and we understand the automation potential. We build a system that really handles the incoming rate of change. And if you're operating at scale, this is doubly true, right? If you're using concepts like you know, auto scaling, or even kind of when your app can interact with the AWS API and almost make decisions on the fly around the scale it needs to support, you know, whatever incoming activity within the application there is. That paradigm is very, very different than kind of the manual perspective we had back in the data center. So when our approaches no longer work, I think, you know, we get concerned because the rate of change in an infrastructure as a service environment, again, depending on how you use it and your scale, you know, is quite frankly staggering. And from a compliance perspective, where you're consistently measuring all of your infrastructure against a set of, you know, kind of where you want that infrastructure to be or what you want it to look like, what state you want it in, that state always changes. And so, you know, we get into this paradigm of, do I have to measure compliance continuously every minute? You know, can I do this based on a time interval? Should I do this based on a change window? You know, should I run a compliance kind of, and even do I have the ability to run a compliance report, you know, on the tail end or at the start of a change window, just to make sure that, or both, just to make sure that I'm not inadvertently changing something that really, really does move me out of that, you know, posture I want to be in. And as you can see on the screen, there are so many different phases for this to happen that, quite frankly, it's not a surprise once you're there that our old tools and approaches don't work. You know, our environments look nothing like they did back in the data center. They can when we start, but again, as we use these cloud-native features, they begin to look, you know, like something that sort of can manage itself over time. Certainly, if we build greenfield applications that know how to do this and are environment aware, if you will. So again, it gets very complex very quickly as you scale, and so we need a new breed of tool to really you know, understand that rate of change and be able to represent it to us effectively. So in response to all of these challenges we've talked about so far, Dome9 has last year really released what we call the compliance engine, which is sort of phase one of a bigger initiative within Dome9, and it's really built to aggregate all of the account data you bring to Dome9. So we haven't talked about this yet. I'll show you this very shortly. But you can bring any number of AWS or other infrastructure as a service accounts to Dome9. And when you do, the platform will aggregate all of that data together. And in fact, you can run compliance reports across all of your AWS accounts at once if that's desired, such that you can bring the power of that data aggregation to your compliance efforts and very, very quickly get a feel for, you know, across the largest Dome9 customers have hundreds of AWS accounts plugged into their single Dome9 account. So imagine the power of being able to very quickly, you know, generate one report that gives you a feel for your sort of security situational awareness all at once. Very, very powerful. And then, you know, being able to identify the gaps in your infrastructure using built-in test suites that we ship with, and Helen introduced them in the start. In fact, we have, I think, one more since we talked about PCI and since we talked about CIS foundations for AWS. So there are internal built-in standards that you can leverage, you know, right away, kind of delivering that quickest time to compliance across your network efforts. And then once the compliance engine really finds what's wrong or what deviates from that desired standard, there are many other capabilities outside of the compliance engine which allow you to fix those, edit them in place, and then keep them fixed with features like tamper protection, which we'll introduce later in our presentation today. Fixing issues in place with remediation tools within Dome 9. So there are two ways to use Dome 9, kind of a read-only information fashion, or in a full manage read-write way. And it's in that way that you can avoid maybe bouncing from a tool like Dome 9, which gives you the information you need, but then moving over to the AWS console to effect change. In read-write mode, you can do that all from Dome 9. So you can benefit from Dome 9's higher level policy object kind of abstraction capabilities and never have to leave the tool even to make changes. Right? You might find a security group with a service with a policy you don't like. You can affect that change right from Dome 9. And then, of course, what we're going to focus on here is to measure, evaluate, and prove compliance in audits with either printable reports, fine-grained interactive information within that report, and then audit trails too within the platform. Everything that you do or that the platform does on your behalf, if you're using it that way, will find its way to the Dome 9 audit trail, which you can use kind of in the product, or you can take out to your favorite SIM tool or log aggregation tool that you've got. So with that, why Dome 9? Why Dome 9 over either native tools with your infrastructure as a service provider or other third-party tools? A couple key reasons. One is that everything I show you today within the compliance engine is powered by deep API integration, not by agents and workloads or appliances in your environment. You connect with an AWS policy and role, and it's that cross-account role that gives Dome 9 some perspective into your AWS efforts. So too, because of that API integration, Dome 9 is able to see or to understand much more than just instances and workloads and operating systems. Right now, we can understand things like, S3 permissions, key rotation within AWS KMS, IAM policies, right? Much more than simple workloads. That API integration gives us that ability for a very, very wide perspective over what you do at AWS. We talked a little bit about the ability to fix it in place. And that might sound somewhat trivial. Why can't I just bounce back to the AWS console and fix it there? I think once you get to understand Dome 9 and some of the capabilities we have to make this to make the understanding of the context of your network security controls that much more easy to understand, I think you'll agree that making the changes within Dome 9 has a lot of benefit over just simplicity and efficiency. There's a benefit in understanding, with things like IP list objects, organizing IP information into much more than just numbers, kind of immediately understandable information with English labels and annotations and descriptions on something as benign as an IP address just makes the management of all of that detail that much more simpler and straightforward. So within Dome 9, you don't have to leave the tool to go and affect the change, for the problems you find within the compliance engine. There's a nice workflow between problem identification, problem solution, and then making sure that that problem never happens. Kind of the fix it, find it, fix it, keep it fixed mentality. And then of course, within the actual compliance engine itself, lots of reasons, how and why it differs from other competing approaches to solving this problem. We'll talk about that, but it's a very, very comprehensive, fast, efficient way. Whether you're using the built-in kind of reports that the capability comes with, or if you're generating your own. We're going to talk about that a little bit once we take a look at the compliance engine. We're going to look at sort of phase 2 with augmenting what we've got in terms of published standards with measurements that might be a little more specific, that are valuable for your organization, but maybe wouldn't be found in a generalized standard. we'll talk about that capability as well. But really, it's the information coming out of the platform. It's built for more than one audience, and so we'll show you all of that kind of live with a product demonstration. Let's do that now. I've got a, normally when we do this presentation, maybe we're at a podium where we don't have reliable kind of internet. That's not the case today. So let's take a look at this rather than look at it in static slide form. Okay. So we're here within the Dome9 dashboard, and just a couple things. We talked about the ability to come and add as many cloud accounts as you have. You'll find that here under the cloud accounts tile. Here, this is kind of an example where we have at least one of every account to showcase, of course, our demo environment. Here we have 2 AWS accounts as well, just to show you where you can, across the Dome9 feature set, where you can aggregate data. And our topic, our focus today on the compliance engine certainly is a feature where, just out of the box natively, we'll aggregate the data from each account up and create this kind of, one run ability where you can measure across all of these very, very efficiently. So within the compliance engine, this is the interface, and kind of above this fold are the what we call rule bundles that Dome9 publishes that you can consume yourself. And you can see they range from PCI to the CIS Foundation's security benchmarks to something new we're working on, sort of a HIPAA high-tech rule bundle implementation. We're not quite there yet, we're close. Part of our ongoing commitment to not only build the most prominent and leverage data security standards support, and you'll find more coming, sort of more NIST standards as well, but also to manage the life cycle of the existing ones. When we debuted with PCI, there were less measurements. Over time, we sort of course, both with the standard changing itself, with every sort of bump and revision, we have maybe potentially some work to do in the standard, but also as the cloud service providers API support more and more functionality. So it's kind of 2 different vectors we look at, the standard itself, but also what the platform supports. And whenever that changes and sort of incrementally updates, so too will we address the standard. But the idea then is to leverage one of these standards, either in a more formal named standard, less formal, best practice driven kind of approach. For our purposes today, let's leverage PCI. I think most people understand the spirit of what PCI is intended for. When you click on a report, we will show you under validation types here the kinds of measurements we do. If you're familiar again with the traditional focus of Dome9, that has been VPCs or VNets or networks, security groups or firewall rules, network ACLs, security group to resource assignment. That's kind of the traditional focus of Dome9. What is focused on within the compliance engine is much, much wider, as you can see under validation types. Yes, we're going to measure things like security group, port access scenarios, having SSH open too broadly. We'll focus on that, but there's much, much more. Are you logging properly? Are you maintaining those logs? What is your IAM MFA policy, sort of account-wide? That sort of thing. You can measure with the compliance engine, and we do measure within this bundle within PCI. I'll scroll these measurements a little bit, but we will, we have some password policy type measurements. We have some CloudTrail logging, lots and lots of capability here. And in the case of an external data security standard like PCI, we will show you for each rule where in the spec it sort of is referenced, right? Where in the spec the rule has to do with, which is very, very key. So let's take this rule bundle and we are going to run this, and when we do, it's probably apparent now that we can run this across one account or we can run this across all the accounts we have plugged in, as we spoke about earlier. We'll do this against our production demo account. We'll click run, and as you can see, you can delve deep as well, right, into a particular VPC or region. We're going to keep it broad in this run, and as you can see, the resulting report was really intended for 2 different purposes. One, above the fold, kind of above this half, we're presenting information in aggregate, how we did from an overall pass-fail ratio. In this case, we didn't do very darn well at all, did we? 28% pass. But then when we failed, if how we failed by severity, unfortunately, we failed by about 90% of severity of high, and then how we failed by resource. In this case, most of our failures have to do with security groups, next instances, next IAM users. Then interactively, kind of how we did per region. So within South Korea, I did a heck of a lot better than I did in my global average, right? I have 21 pass tests, 4 failed tests. So maybe that should really be my model for my global efforts, if you will. So that's the first half of the report, intended again for that management or compliance officer perspective. Second half is more intended for that individual or team you will task with going to fix these problems that were unearthed with with the compliance engine detail. And so we'll scroll down, and here's an example of one I gave verbally not long ago. Here's a measurement that says make sure that no security groups allow super broad sort of any access to SSH, which of course is a sensitive administrative protocol in many cases. So that is much like a traditional network security kind of measurement, and it's one that we can really easily understand. Yet right above it we see that make sure that your VPC flow logging, which is sort of your firewall filter log as a service, for example, is logged, is turned on, and is working in every region. So these measurements do vary from traditional network security sort of port exposure type scenarios to all sorts of other things. So for this one though, because it is so sort of universally understood, let's go with it. So this is one measurement where I tested a lot of things, and my fail ratio isn't bad, but I do have 10 non-complying or fail entities where I do have security groups that allow broad access to SSH, right? And if I hit expand, I'll find out exactly which security groups these are. So now I've got the list of sort of problem states that I need to go and address. Now if I click each security group, and we haven't looked at this capability of Dome9 yet, but if I click each one, I'm going to click this really long name for SG. Actually, let me click this Web Monitor one. I'll open that in a dedicated browser tab. And now this will allow me to go in and look at the security group in detail, like I might be able to do with the AWS console, but look at a little more. So I can look at my inbound rules. If I have any outbound rules, I can look at those. I can look at the membership, right, from either instances or services. And then I can look at referencing security groups as well. What security groups contain rules that reference this one. I can also, if the security group is in full protection mode, I can also edit each security control like you saw me do. So there's a way to move from identifying within the compliance engine what's wrong to listing all of the entities that that failed this particular check, to then actually moving, and let me open up another one, perhaps one that's open in full protection. Here's one. This is one where, and I could do the same thing with this security group if I move it over to full protection, but here's one where it's already in that state and I can do my edits, right? If I found, for example, that my SSH is wide open, which is what the condition my compliance engine was searching for, I can now edit this and say, let me close it, right? Instead of opening up, let me close it, and maybe I can employ another Dome9 feature called dynamic access leasing to provide the access I need to key individuals that should be accessing that service, but keep it closed for everybody else, right? Kind of reducing that generalized attack surface. So there's lots of ability within the platform to not only find the problem within the compliance engine, but then to move over, fix it, and of course leverage tamper protection to keep it fixed. So the other side of the compliance engine we haven't looked at quite yet is what you can do once you've generated a report. We've talked about who the report's intended for, the different purposes for the report, and then the workflow associated with finding and fixing sort of the problem states. What also maybe is important is to note that you can save each run of the report to look at in the future, either informally to sort of map your journey to a more compliant state, whatever that means for your organization, or in a more formalized way to provide a history for your auditor to essentially for the same reason, just to provide it a little more formalized for an auditor to say, oh, okay, you are charting towards every month or every whatever interval that you're saving this this report run, you are charting towards a more compliant state, and I can see that through the detailed saves. You'll find that in your assessment history. You'll also find that within your dashboard. Dashboard is maybe a better graphical means of being able to quickly assess from a pass-fail ratio perspective, how you did. As you can see, the sort of beta moniker on the left-hand side, this is a very, very new feature within the Dome9 compliance engine. But the intention is, again, to provide this at-a-glance perspective of over time, how I'm charting. And a means to kick off assessments as well, with this run all assessments up in the top right. But the ability really is to chart your compliance efforts over time. The assessment history allows you to go a little bit deeper. Of course, this shows me kind of in a table fashion each run, but I can also then go in and bring up the historical run of that report. It's not just kind of the high level data. I can look at the March 23rd run of this initial HIPAA technical safeguard bundle that we're building. So I can go into any past run and get some very, very detailed information around how that run's stacked up against others. So back to our presentation. So we talked about the reports really, again, intended for more than one audience, both the information at aggregate, the compliance officer, the manager, but then also the practitioner who will go and solve that problem. So we also talked a little bit about the follow-on capabilities from the Dome9 platform. Outside of the compliance engine, there's still a lot in the platform that speaks to what you'll have to do after you identify an issue, namely understand it maybe in the context of other security groups and controls, and then fix it. Fix it with the inline capabilities of Dome9, and then keep it fixed with the notion of tamper protection. In the Dome9 audit trail, you'll find every indication of when a security group or control was tampered with, and if in tamper protection, what Dome9 did about it. So although our time today is really focused on the compliance engine, we are, the whole platform really speaks to compliance in lots of different ways. So get to know the whole Dome9 platform if you're interested in comprehensive compliance. So we're just about wrapping up kind of this quarter's webinar schedule, and what we used to do was talk about compliance in one, and then sort of extended compliance, or what we call software-defined governance, in another. I'm happy to be able to do a little bit of teasing the software-defined governance in this webinar, just because we're changing the formats a little bit next quarter. So let me talk to you maybe just for a couple of minutes around beyond compliance, right? This notion of governance. These two terms are certainly related, but they're different. When we think about governance, I think about the kinds of things that I need to do as an infrastructure owner to ensure that my generalized policy, the way I want to see infrastructure managed, the way I want to see credentials provisioned and published, the way I want to see encryption used, for example, these are all maybe less about a data security standard, but more about practices that I want to ensure are followed, and really I want to mandate how infrastructure is managed within my environment. That's how I think of governance, kind of like compliance, but much bigger and much more broad. In response to this, Dome9 has built a means to define rules. And in fact, everything I've shown you within the compliance engine so far within the presentation today has been built on top of what we call GSL. That stands for Governance Specification Language. And it's a means to express governance, compliance, or even generalized security policy. And the Dome9 compliance engine is purpose-built to take this expression and help you, measure the infrastructure you manage with Dome9 in a continual basis, right? Telling you how far you are away from that desired baseline. Not that different from what we've talked about thus far, but involving a lot more flexibility. Everything we've done so far has been off the shelf, right? I've taken a PCI report, or I've taken that CIS Foundation for AWS, and I've run it. But in there, you're never going to have a measurement that is super specific to your organization. For example, let's take a guess at what these rules say, and then we'll talk about how they're comprised and how they're built using GSL. Here's a rule that says, well, as you can probably tell, this security group should have rules to do with SSH, so TCP port 22, with a wide open scope. It should not have, but maybe you're just trying to write a rule that goes up and finds every instance of a security group that's got, a broad scope associated with SSH. That's it. In a handful of words and in a near English kind of, at least understandable, if not authorable, means you've defined, all of that business logic in a handful of words. Here's another one. Instance should have name and tags with key owner. So should have a name and should be tagged with a specific key that includes the term owner. Again, something that should be straightforward to do, but within other solutions, if they don't have a standard rule, you either can't do it or it's very, very complex to do, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. I'll give you an example of something that is, in our eyes, very, very far too complex for for a compliance or governance kind of initiative. Here's the last one: security group where the name is default should not have any inbound rules. We know it's a best practice for those default security groups at AWS to not be used, both in terms of association with a resource, but even with a rule. We know that security groups are denied by default, so with no rules in a security group, you can be assured that there's no traffic permitted to any resource that maybe mistakenly gets assigned to it. So this is very, very important. It should be table stakes really for any policy or any sort of governance measurement. You would want to for sure have that one in, and it's very, very simple to represent with GSL. So GSL really creates this human readable, if not non-developer skill set required to author approach to policy setting. And as we get closer to the people that create the policy are typically not the people who write it, right? They come and they convey that to a developer skill set individual or team, and they will write that rule for whatever sort of compliance measurement initiative they have. That translation typically involves a little bit of loss of detail or misunderstanding, or at least kind of a misunderstanding in the spirit of what's being authored. And when we can move to where a policy creator can write the rule themselves, I think we move to a much more efficient and precise state. So in other competitive approaches to this problem, often you are mandated to write a lot of code. Here's an example where we're looking at measuring, do we have an open CIFS, which is a common internet file sharing protocol? Do we have a common, do we have an open sort of port exposure around a very sensitive file sharing protocol? It takes this much code to be able to do that. In some solutions within DOM 9, it's a single rule with a very straightforward, easy to understand sort of a syntax. 90 characters, right? Very, very simple, something anybody could craft, and certainly something anybody could understand. So with that, maybe let's have a look. Let me show you quickly what this looks like within DOM 9. We had a look at our existing bundles of policy. Here, below this kind of separator, you'll find a bunch of bundles that we've built within our demo portal. And I've got a couple here that I've worked on that I think are representative of what's important and how flexible the syntax can be. So here's a real basic one, but one I think you'll agree you'll never find in a generalized data security standard where, look, my instances, every virtual machine or instance I have within EC2 should have been launched from these 3 AMIs. These could be the ones I've sort of blessed organizationally that I want each instance to be based from. So I have obviously some configuration control over what's out there, what's being served. And this report will surface anything that has not, right? Any failed resource out of this report will be something that hasn't been launched from these 3 pre-approved AMIs. So, very specific, but very, very simple to do. Here's a great tag one, right? Instance should have tags contained. We talked about this rule, but this is just the first part, right? This is the conditional. Instance should have tags contain key prod. That's an effective rule in itself, but we could go on and we could build more conditions. And, ors, has another attribute. We can get way more specific such that we reduce the likelihood of false positives. And when we do that, we create a report that's much, much more valuable and accurate and can be further trusted. So, typically in a generalized data security standard, those measurements will be good, but maybe not all super applicable to your environment. And so you will create some false positives, some, don't worry about that measurement. Here you can clone that PCI bundle, for example, and then work within it to add conditionals to the rules. Say, yeah, I want this rule measured, but only under, instances or resources that are named a certain way or tagged a certain way. You can get very, very specific. Here's one that I like. Here's one measuring more than just port exposure. Here's a subnets. So in a VPC, subnets that are tagged a certain way. In this case, that are tagged to denote maybe a production network versus something else. Should really only have network ACL policies, inbound policies that deal with private traffic. My policy should never allow any public traffic at all when my subnets are tagged in this way that denotes I'm in a production state or production environment. So yeah, again, very, very specific. And one thing that's maybe really important to call out if you're looking at this and saying, yeah, it's simple, but you still need a little bit of a feel for the syntax. You're correct, you do. If you don't, if it's day one and you're new to GSL and DOM 9, you can click within and use what we call the rule builder. And this rule builder will allow you to move through a rule sort of in a guided fashion, right? If we scrap the last idea, let's move to something maybe a little more broad and say, I want to know where my identity and access management policy mandates that I have MFA turned on account-wide or not. I want to know of all the accounts I've got plugged into DOM 9 where that's the case. So I can click on IAM, and I can say IAM should have what's that? Account MFA enabled, right? Account-wide MFA should be turned on. And I can quickly test it within our single AWS prod account that we've got connected here. When I do that quick unit test of my rule, I can see that it doesn't comply. So although I might have MFA turned on for some accounts, organizational-wide, I do not have MFA mandated. And it's that easy to test. So very straightforward. You can get very specific, and if you don't know the language, you can start with the rule builder approach, which will guide you and will guide you through that straightforward process of building rules. So again, whether you start net new on yours, or as you can see, you can clone a bundle and you can begin to augment or edit the rules, adding in the specific conditions that you're interested in searching for. With that, really all that's left is to talk a little bit about what else we do. I alluded kind of in the presentation today that DOM 9 is much more than compliance auditing. Throughout the platform, we offer security group management, tamper protection, which we talked a little bit about. If something tries to change the state of your controls outside of your use of DOM 9, DOM 9 can automatically revert back to the last known good state, kind of your quote-unquote golden security policy automatically for you on your behalf, and then of course tell you and report to you what it did. Along with a number of features, we touch a little bit upon dynamic access leasing, where you can selectively whitelist firewall exceptions and really handle the life cycle of that event, making sure at the end of the year, you're not left with any sort of Swiss cheese firewall syndrome. As well as probably one of our flagship capabilities we talked nothing of in this session, clarity, getting that Visio diagram sort of map around all the different traffic possibilities within any particular cloud network. Certainly all speaking to compliance at one level, but none more directly than the specific compliance and software-defined governance feature set we've talked about today thus far. With that, I really think that's it. I think hopefully we have time for one or two questions. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, Patrick, it looks like we have a few questions. The first one is, I use Trusted Advisor to evaluate my compliance at AWS. What does DOM 9 do that Trusted Advisor doesn't? Patrick, we have
Yes.
a second question. I think we lost audio there for a second. In your demo environment, reports run very quickly. What does performance look like at scale?
Right. Yeah, good question. As you saw me run that PCI report, and maybe I'll share my screen out again. As you saw me run that PCI report, it did happen very, very quickly. There's a couple of reasons it does. One is that Dome9 has a local data model, right? We're constantly interrogating that AWS API, making sure we have a current idea of what the state of your security controls and the state of your infrastructure in general is. And so when we run a report, we exercise based on that local data model. So it is very, very fast, even when running across an aggregate. So at scale, I think, if we run an assessment and we do it across all of our accounts, I think you'll find that it runs almost as fast. We sort of parallel process these across that, again, that localized data model. And this report, in parentheses across the measurement there, has 75 measurements. Our biggest reports have near 500. And those ones will, maybe take a second or two longer than these do, but it all happens very, very quickly. And the idea is that you can assess often, and based on lots of conditions. We talked about, many customers have a Lambda function that pokes the Dome9 API to assess on a time-based interval, maybe every half an hour, every 30 minutes, some every day. Others do it based on condition, maybe at like I think we talked about earlier, at the start or maybe at the end or both of a change window, or of a specific event happening that might have some change to do or change associated with it. So yeah, I think it depends a little bit, but the execution is always very, very fast, and will likely get faster over time.
Okay, and we have one final question. You mentioned that you can measure compliance via API. Can I build this into my existing automation framework?
Yeah, so absolutely you can. And if I maybe let me just bring over as an example some of the documentation we have here. So our API is very, very, outside of compliance in general, our API is very, very full functioned. Everything that I did in the platform, and the focus we had today was on the compliance engine, but everything I do in the platform you can power by API as well. And so here in our API documentation, I just want to share with you a little bit. You can create those rule bundles. You can define new rules. You don't have to use the interactive console to do that. You can do this, by Dome9 API. You can also assess, of course, by API, as we just talked about, being tied to a specific window, tied to a condition. Maybe you've got existing automation built in your platform, in your kind of AWS ecosystem already, and there are kind of key points where running a compliance assessment make a lot of sense. You can just make a quick call to the Dome9 API to run an assessment, and get a result. Either come back to the platform or the portal to interactively evaluate that result, or evaluate the result as part of the Dome9 call. So yes, lots of opportunity to work with Dome9 and the compliance engine non-interactively as well.
Okay, great. Well, those were the questions that we had. So thank you, Patrick. All right, everyone, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending. I want to remind you that we do have a handout on the Dome9 ARC Compliance Engine in GoToWebinar. Please feel free to download it at this time. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the email address q@dome9.com. I have a few final notes. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today and would like to experience the Dome9 ARC platform for yourself, we are offering a 14-day free trial. Please visit our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our home page. Just register and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to activate your free trial. Additionally, if you liked the webinar today and would like to hear more about the multi-public cloud security solutions Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for several of our upcoming webinars. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please contact us through our website and let us know. With that, we thank you for your time today and hope you found the content informative. This now concludes the Dome 9 webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.